In the writing world, OC stands for Original Character, and obviously as writers we are going to create quite a few of these in our time, maybe even hundreds, depending on how prolific we are or how epic our casts become. And theorizing them can be easy because it's fun to do something new and exciting, but actually developing them into someone really meaningful and memorable is a lot harder. So in this video, I'm going to talk about my personal system of making OCs, and in the process, I'm going to be making a new OC, and I'm going to be making him as cringe as possible. Okay, I'm just going to say this right now too, but nothing on Earth is really cringe to me. I guess calling things cringe is what's really cringe to me because it feels like overcompensation for insecurity. And maybe some cosplay TikToks make me wince a bit, but I just wanted to make sure that I made it clear that this OC may be what other people consider cringy, but personally I don't care. In fact, he might become my favorite cringest OC ever, who knows? Maybe not. One of my OCs lie is like a manic pixie dream twink, and Leland falls in love with a catboy, so I mean, to be fair, he's like a big large cat man, but regardless, I'm already pretty cringe, so this isn't going to be very hard. Okay, beginning note, as always, this character development process is going to be very different for everyone. If anything that you hear in this video helps you out, that's awesome. Maybe leave a comment if it does. If you don't hear anything revolutionary here, that is fine too. I hope you enjoy it nonetheless, and maybe leave a comment with your own tips. So, the first distinction that I think is important is to realize whether or not your character is organic. An organic character is someone who comes around naturally because you're going to tell a story, and they're going to be a vehicle. You had an idea, and now you need to put someone into it, but they have very few restrictions in terms of character traits. A more inorganic character is usually one that comes around because you need to serve a specific role in a story. Maybe you need a foil to another character, or you need someone who can perform a particular action in order to move the plot along. For example, I had an idea the other day for a story about a character who doesn't have any friends that he can be honest with. He can't talk about his feelings or important things or how he really thinks, and is actually a really emotional guy, but no one knows it. And then one day he gets very drunk and ends up spewing to a stranger about all these things, and to his surprise, this stranger understands and even agrees with his viewpoints. They care about the same things, and a relationship starts to develop. These would be my more organic characters. They are here for a specific role, which is to be the main players of a specific story, and they do have certain restrictions in terms of personality, mostly in that the main character has to be inherently introspective and conflicted, but for the most part they can be anything else. That sounds boring, right? I think so too, but that's because I haven't developed much else about it, including other characters. My initial instinct is that the rest of the cast would be made up of this first character's friend group, and then eventually the other character's friend group, and then ultimately family or even a third social circle, and that's what leads us to our inorganic characters. My main two characters have so much freedom and basically dictate the narrative, while these supporting characters are going to need to be molded a lot more specifically in order to lead the main two through that narrative effectively. And while all characters need to be multidimensional, this is a situation where these secondary characters could exist solely to be a foil. Maybe this emotional main character has one very cold and aloof friend who is sort of difficult and a little combative. He may also have a flighty, lighthearted friend who is always kind, but will not face serious topics that the main character wants to deal with. And maybe he has a third friend who's just an ass and outright disagrees with him with everything he says on any opinion, leading him to keep his feelings hidden. These are all characters that are sort of pigeonholed into their role. We know what personalities we want them to have, and we know what they're going to do to help push the story along, but we don't have to think too hard about how they're going to be represented in the story. That being said, it's important to remember that very few people in real life are as one note as the flirty friend or the douchebag, so it's not that these characters can't also be developed and have very specific motivations and reasonings behind their behavior. In fact, we all know that it's side characters we tend to fall in love with most, so there's no reason to say that these guys are relegated to the back burner. They're still as developed as the main cast, they're just developed a little differently. So I try not to dwell too hard on what I call the census questions. So this means race, gender, sex, gender identity, orientation, etc, etc. These are not things that I really labor over. Most of the time I have a slight vision of how a character looks already, and I go from there in terms of skin tone and race, which will lead to things like culture and heritage, etc. And while I don't think too hard about roles when I'm filling a cast, I do strive to be inclusive, So if I find myself with characters that I have no visions of, I do look at what I already have and try to diversify the rest of the characters. Now when I say that I try not to think about it too hard, it's not because I don't care, it's because I personally don't write stories that are about these things. There's a big difference between writing a character and writing a narrative. I tend not to focus on themes that revolve around identities in this way, which means I don't strongly write about homophobia or racism or things of that nature. But if you do, then these are more important questions to solidify. Regardless of what you're writing, these are things that should and will influence a character's development too. For this example, I have to consider how the society that my characters are in treat an inherently emotional male versus an inherently emotional female. So that's why I start to consider these questions at the very beginning. So while I don't worry about filling in an exact quota of diversity, these questions are still extremely important because that range of representation matters a lot to me, and in my opinion, they should matter to everyone. And remember, if you don't belong to a certain demographic, you can't really write their experiences. We must remember that lived experiences we do and don't have, and what we're really prepared to write in that respect. Okay, it's everyone's favorite part of my videos again. This is when I make my lists. If you've seen previous videos, you know that one of the first things I ever do with a project is write down absolutely every single little thing I can think of that I've already conjured up for it. And then I organize that list into several smaller lists, one being character ideas. I always write the initial timeline now too, and then I'll make a little reference sheet for every individual character and start making notes on them. Usually a bit disorganized at first, but it'll get cleaned up later. This is when I start to make them more robust in terms of personality. So for example, maybe that aloof friend that we mentioned earlier has a bad relationship with an absent parent, and that's why they're a bit distant or at arm's length. Perhaps the flighty friend is terrified of starting conflict, so they never want to get into a serious conversation out of fear that they may start a fight. And what if the rude friend is actually only combative because they're trying to compensate for being ignored at home amongst their siblings or someone that they perceive as somehow better than them? These are ideas that came to me really quickly, and they need to be more detailed, but they're really good starting points for developing these inorganic side characters that otherwise would be pretty one-dimensional. As for the two main characters, they need a bit more attention, and this is where my advice is a little less concrete and more just do your thing. There will definitely be parts of these characters that are simply necessary. If I'm writing a character fighting with inner emotions, then yeah, I know this guy is going to be a little more empathetic than others. But otherwise, what's coming to you? What's clicking? What's not clicking? What are your natural first ideas for these characters? Write them all down, even conflicting ones. You don't have to use them all, and you can decide later which ones fit best. So here's where we wed character development and demographics. Since the main narrative in my story is about breaking out of a shell to care more, and we're seeing that theme told through the eyes of a male, I think that the person he meets is actually a trans man who transitioned later in life, so he understands how society treats women in regards to emotion too. That feels like a fairly unique way to look at the story, and it even kind of opens things up to a really easy dynamic, which would be the emotional guy is going to learn a lot from this guy, and this guy is going to find solace in someone who sees him for more who he is rather than his identity. Alright, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of forgot that one of them was supposed to be kind of cringe, and I don't want to make a clickbaity title, so here we go. My main guy is a pastel e-boy, and he wears those cat ear headphones so that he looks like a cat boy. He likes to wear glittery bondage bracelets and a choker like a sparkle dog. The only foreign language he really knows is a bit of Japanese, which he learned so that he could better understand what was happening in the Jujutsu Kaisen manga. There's a bookshelf in his room with lots of sophisticated queer literature, but he mostly reads fanfiction on his phone. Hell, he writes fanfiction on his phone. He has a sketchbook that's full of anime-style sketches and cat personas that he scans and posts on DeviantArt. But since he has to keep all of this a secret from his judgmental friends, he does this mostly on stream with a small audience who enjoys how cringy he is while he's playing Genshin Impact. Sometimes he wears a mask with cat whiskers on it or a bandage over his nose, and he'll wear a pastel blue wig when he's streaming if he's not cosplaying already. Again though, I would like to reiterate that younger, cooler people than I have labeled all of these things as cringe. I think this guy sounds cool as hell. Anyway, a lot of these things may change, but right now I have this cool, fun, sexy list of stuff to mull over, and that's what step 4 is, which is advice that I truly do implore you to try if you're having a hard time with your latest project. Stop. Just completely stop. Put the project away for at least 1 month. When things come to you, write them down. Think about it a bit in your idle time, but don't sit down and try to develop anything any further. You should already have an idea of a timeline and some themes and narrative threads plotted out, and now you need to take a moment away. I don't know how to explain this step other than every time I start a project, I get super into it for a few weeks and I can't wait to get started on it. But then I do get started and I crash and burn almost immediately, which usually means I get writer's block when I realize that I don't know these characters well enough yet for them to come to me naturally. I end up having to take a break before I can get much done, and in those weeks away, something just happens. I think it's that most important, obviously best ideas have stuck, and the other ideas have faded away. I come back to it in a month, and I suddenly just know these characters, and I can write them without a reference sheet. I know this is really nebulous conceptual advice. There is no scientific basis for why I do this, but it always works. And I think that's the thing about creating, right? We all have our own processes, and they're almost always a mix of your imagination working in an almost scientific, methodical way that you can point at and describe to others, and then completely inexplicable strokes of creative genius that just happen. And you don't know how that is or what words can verbalize it. I know that I'm making lists, and that really helps my brain organize ideas, but I have no idea what's happening in that time off. I just know that when I come back, I suddenly understand that my cringe OC is named Ryan, but he goes by RyRy840 online because that's twice as good as 420, even though he's never smoked in his life. It's bizarre how this happens, but I can at least point at the fact that some time away is what helps. So I truly do recommend you try that next time, especially if you find yourself hitting writer's block before you can even get anything out. The final part of this process for me is the first writing exercises that I do with these characters. Sometimes I do just jump right into the project I want to make with them, but I almost always end up changing it so drastically that I find it helps to just spend some quiet time with them, writing little images that come to me. Small scenes that sound interesting that motivate me to write. I'll go ahead and I'll get those down. This helps me understand them as characters for the most part, and it gets me into a headspace that I can understand for them. I have a Patreon project running right now that is on its 4th iteration. I initially wrote it as a monthly project, then made it a standalone novelette prologue, and then I reworked that monthly project, and then I made it a weekly one-shot instead. It is wild how many times I've written these characters in the same scenarios, and I've gotten to the same part of the timeline just to quit and rework the same story. But I think that's an interesting thing to watch a creator do, and my patrons don't seem to mind. But at this point, I can write 1,000 words about them in 30 minutes. I've been writing these characters for years, and they come to me so easily that it's second nature. The same is true of my monthly project, which just goes to show that the more time you spend with your characters, the easier they become to write. Because you're getting to know them just like you would anyone that you meet in real life. Except these people are in your head, and you control them. So don't get too comfortable or weird about it. To wrap things up, I think that the fact that I've written so many versions of these characters just goes to show that ultimately this process of character development almost never really ends. You'll definitely get more comfortable writing new character as time goes on, but there's almost always something new to discover about your OCs. I also really quickly want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I hit 50 subs before the new year, and I am sitting at 55 at the time of recording this. I am so grateful for all the views and the subs and the really nice comments. I really hope that I can continue to produce content I am proud of and that you guys like. I hope you find some fun and creativity this year, and as always, happy reading.